As we interact with the world around us, we rarely take a step back to look at all the inner workings that contribute to our day-to-day lives. Behind every bustling city are thousands of pollinator species that are critical for maintaining our food security, economic flow, and environmental well-being. However, in many densely developed areas, there are minimal spaces available for these pollinators to call home, causing populations to falter. In order to avoid losing such essential species, cities must think critically about ways to incorporate sustainable infrastructure and revitalize current space into habitats. Hi, my name is Barbs Mendez. My senior project, Pocket Pollinator Gardening, explores how people can utilize underused green space in urban areas to cultivate robust pollinator populations. A commonly overlooked and underused green space in cities is traffic circles. While owned by the city, traffic circles can be maintained by community members and also serve as an ideal place to plant a pollinator garden, which is a garden that provides a habitat for pollinator species that typically contains flowering plants, a water source, and other attractive features. I decided to create a garden after reading about the alarming population decline of pollinators and learning about how such small creatures contribute so much to our world. The placement of this garden was inspired after noticing that traffic circle foliage in my neighborhood that once brightened the community and served as a habitat for many insects and small animals had been replaced by cement. Pocket pollinator gardening is a perfect way to bridge the gap between dense urban development and the environment, increase local biodiversity efforts, and most importantly, provide habitats for endangered species. Pollinator species are insects and small animals that are critical to the pollination process. Bees, butterflies, bats, and birds are among the many species that do the bulk of the pollination procedure. However, for my garden, I focus specifically on the most endangered species: honeybees, monarch butterflies, and hummingbirds. Since the 1990s, there has been a significant decrease in these pollinators' populations, largely due to habitat loss, climate change, and exposure to harmful pests, chemicals, and plants. This 30-year span has reduced these species' populations by roughly 40 to 60%, and with them being one of the largest contributors to our environment, agricultural production, and economy, it's important to maintain or create gardens that can serve as habitats to protect pollinators. Pollinators play a substantial role in maintaining our environment, from being a key factor in the pollination process of over 300,000 plant species to contributing to climate change mitigation. These little species have a lot going on. The pollinator-plant relationship benefits both parties, with pollinators gaining a source of food while simultaneously continuing the plant's life cycle, moving pollen from flower to flower. This relationship doesn't just rely on the pollinators. This process is also extremely dependent on the native plant species, as invasive plants can essentially steal pollinating opportunities. A native plant is one local to the area and is adjusted to the habitat, climate, and pollinators themselves, whereas invasive plants take over habitats and most of the time are physically inaccessible for pollinators to reach their nectar. Since pollinator species don't know the difference between a native flower or invasive plant, it's important to plant native species when possible to sustain our ecosystem's biodiversity and provide food sources to bees, butterflies, and other pollinators. Unfortunately, invasive plants aren't the only thing hindering pollinators, as climate change has given them harsh conditions to survive in. With the dramatic fluctuations in temperature levels, it has hit populations hard. The temperature change causes early blooming, and even as little as a 3-day bloom mismatch can negatively impact bees' health, which makes them less likely to reproduce and more prone to catching diseases. Temperature change also reduces the percentage of blooming flowers, making it difficult for pollinators to find a source of nectar. A similar situation has proven to be an issue for hummingbirds, as the rising temperatures cause them to come back early from their migration. So the early blooming doesn't necessarily impact their health, but hummingbirds need to prepare a nest to settle in first. And over the past 40 years, this timing has shrunk their prep time by 13 days, giving them virtually no time to create a nest and find proper food sources. Monarch butterflies unfortunately are impacted by climate change in the same way as bees and hummingbirds are. But on top of that, they're losing milkweed, a crucial plant for butterflies as it's the only flower the species will eat throughout their metamorphosis and lay their eggs on. Much like flowers, crops also heavily rely on pollinators. In fact, researchers credit pollinators for 1 out of every 3 bites of food eaten. Since roughly 90 species of crops rely in part or completely on pollination, it's critical to boost these populations to avoid the risk of lower production and variety, which in turn would create higher food prices and more cases of food insecurity. As it currently stands, pollinators contribute $217 billion to the global economy, with honeybees alone being responsible for $5 billion of agricultural production in the United States. Without them, it could cause detrimental damage to the global market and threaten the jobs of farmers and beekeepers alike. With the pandemic, farmers have already faced a loss of staff and land, resulting in lower income. It's vital to increase pollinator populations as it can aid private landowners to improve the quality of their crops, along with the health of their landscape, which in turn provides visibility and higher profits. For beekeepers, unstable bee colonies have caused them to collectively lose over 10 million beehives, which sell for roughly $200 each. This issue has been going on since the early 2000s, and studies from the Environmental Protection Agency has found a main source to be CCD, which stands for Colony Collapse Disorder. While it is unknown what exactly causes CCD, researchers believe it could be from invasive pests called veromite and affects roughly 22% of colonies. But the loss of population for these species can be saved, especially if direct action is taken. This can be done by continuing to incorporate usable green space in urbanized areas, but also by utilizing space in our own homes. To create this greener future, cities must think critically about how to effectively educate and create policies to protect the environment. Studies have shown that finding this balance can increase one's own environmental consciousness and luckily help increase endangered plant and insect populations. Living in an urban area, I wanted to do my part in showing that even small pockets of green space can be turned into something beneficial for the environment and that it is possible for the environment in built form to have a positive relationship. A huge part of creating my garden was to involve the community and possibly inspire others to do the same and pocket green space around where they live or in their own gardens. I spoke to neighbors in person as well as on online community boards like Nextdoor about my project, getting a lot of support and help. In the meantime, I visited local nurseries to check out their plant selections and recommendations for flowers. From my research, I knew it was important to choose native plant species to the Pacific Northwest region and that bright, colorful flowers attract pollinators best. I decided to buy my flowers from Swanson's, choosing a mix of potted flowers and seeds. Swanson's had an entire section dedicated to pollinator attracting plants, which made it very helpful to narrow down what I needed. Since I did this project a bit early on, not all the flowers were available yet, so it did limit a few of my options. Luckily, Swanson's had an extensive seed selection that made up for that and provided plenty of options for different pollinators. While clearing the garden, I had lost a significant amount of dirt, so my next step was a supply store, where I got a few bags of dirt, some mulch to use when the garden was finished to give it a clean look and also help attract butterflies, and then get some basic gardening supplies like a watering can and extra gloves for those helping out. This is a glimpse of how the gardening day went. Each person did different things to help prep, plant, and water. At the beginning of the event, I had a few people show up ready to help plant, but only a handful of them stayed the entire time. This worked well given the size of the circle and the continuous flow of people stopping by. I ended up having 3 people come by and donate plants, chatting with me about the project and thanking me for making something that the entire neighborhood could enjoy. I also had at least 7 people walk by and ask questions on what a pollinator garden was. I began to notice I was receiving the same type of questions, so this inspired me to create a website that would incorporate the general questions I had received and compile them into one place. Once I created my website, I printed out a QR code and attached it to a garden stake, so people walking by my garden that might have questions could easily find answers through scanning it. During the process of creating my website, I constantly kept the questions I had gotten in mind, so I would be able to successfully incorporate them into the site. I wanted to make sure the website was informative but also easy to use and navigate, so I kept it pretty simple with only having 3 tabs. The first tab, Gardening for Pollinators, covered the general knowledge about pollinator gardening. I wanted to show that anyone can create their own garden, so I broke the process down into 3 parts. I also gave tips for when to plant seeds or flowers, the advantages and disadvantages of each option, and how a mix of both can be a great alternative to choosing just one when considering affordability, time, and space. The most important tip I added was to not use herbicide or pesticides, as they do more harm than good. There are so many pollinator species out there, over 200,000, so I wanted to give some insight on common ones that may be found in these types of gardens. The middle tab, Native Plants by Region, starts with a blurb on the importance of choosing native species, before giving users an option to look at the top 10 pollinator plants in different regions. I narrowed it down to 4 areas: Western, Midwest, Southern, and Eastern. There is some overlap on the type of plants. However, for example, bee balm in the Western region will be a different type than in the Eastern region, even if it has the same name. I credited the Xerces Society at the bottom of the page, as it's an extremely useful website that provides a longer list of plant types for different regions and states. When doing my research portion, I remember wishing I could have a site that contains everything I need, so I decided to do that with my website. The Resources tab lists the main websites I used during the research process, and I thought it could be helpful for people wanting to learn more about pollinators or potentially doing a project like mine. After lots of work and help from my community on the neighborhood gardening day, I'm extremely happy with how the traffic circle turned out. Before clearing the traffic circle, there was a significant amount of overgrown brittle bushes covered in thorns. The circle looked much larger at this stage, as over time dirt and debris had accumulated over the cement. I was a little disappointed to find I had a reduced gardening size, but continued on due to the effort already put in place and because I wanted to drive the idea that pollinator habitats could be grown anywhere. Luckily, this space still made a great garden, and after a few hours of working with volunteering neighbors, I was able to complete the planting stage of my project. Since having planted the pollinator garden, I have noticed that most of the potted plants have tripled in size, and the seeds have started to sprout. Since planting my garden, I frequently walk up to water it and take care of any weeds that try to grow in it. I have learned so much from this experience, from how to effectively engage with community members of all ages on a project, to learning about the different ways to help minimize discrepancies between urbanization and the environment, all while providing habitats for endangered pollinator species. Thank you for watching.